author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we are talking the upset that came to Washington, D.C., what's happening for the Republicans, what's happening for the Democrats, and more importantly, what's happening for the American people. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. And you're on Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides, and we're joined by today Liberty Nation's executive editor, Lisa K. Donner. Now, Lisa, thanks for coming in. I really, really wanted to get your take on Donald Trump's proposal for the new jewel of the Mediterranean, the Riviera of the Middle East, Trump's plans for Gaza.
Good to be here, Mark. I feel like it's deja vu all over again, with North Korea.
Sure.
They had such beautiful land in order to make skyscrapers and into, he's a builder. He sees everything in that kind of perspective. And so he looks at Gaza, which, isn't much of a piece of land, but even he can dream that it's going to be gorgeous and beautiful. I think the business of the U.S. is going to take it over is probably, an art of the deal move.
Yes. Yeah, that's pretty much where I came in on it, that the idea that the U.S. is going to go in there and, it might happen, never put anything to the side when dealing with Donald Trump, but it'll go in and own the territory and then have some major building projects with contractors and whatnot.
A jewel by the sea. You can see the billboards now. Right?
Well, they're not selling much beachfront property nowadays. Barack Obama and the like have brought it all up. But so there's this right on the Mediterranean. But I do think it's an art of the deal thing where it's like you shoot for the moon and you say you want everything, you want all this, but what you really want is somewhere several pegs down. And then when people kind of get panicked about he's going for everything, and then they come back and they'll negotiate somewhere in the middle, which is probably what Trump is after. And what do you think that is that Trump's after?
Okay, but Mark, we got to talk about the elephant in the room. The leftist media they bite at this every time. They go for the simplest answer, which is not where he's going, and they hair on fire, moments. It just is astounding to me that they're still back there with their brains trying to figure out what he's doing.
I don't think that they're naturally stupid people in the fourth estate. I don't believe that. I think there's smart people in there. So there must be another reason. Because, I heard what he said, and I put it through what I like to call my levels of analysis. Well, I do it with nursery rhymes as well, like Humpty Dumpty, for example. I'm up to 7 levels of analysis with Humpty Dumpty about what it means. And I did that straight away with Donald Trump's thing. And I am not, much as I would like to think it, I am not smarter than the entire collective of the U.S. Fourth Estate. So what are they doing? Why do they go for, as you say, the lowest possible interpretation of what's happening? And I think the idea is that they're not allowed to dig deeper or get speculative because their readership doesn't want anything other than Trump did this was bad, therefore it's terrible and evil. And so I don't think their readership will allow it because they want a reinforcement of their prejudices, their beliefs, and they don't want to face anything that's outside of that particular bubble.
Well, you may be right. It seems to me like they miss the essence of what he's going after, and maybe that's the reason they do it. But it just seems so predictable. Let's just say that, predictable.
It's the lowest common denominator of thought, right? That's what they're aiming for. They're looking for what will appeal most broadly to the people who are on their side of the argument. And that's not just saying that this is the left that does it. But.
Well, I worry, Mark, that they think that Americans only read headlines. They're all pretty stupid. And so we have to go for the lowest common denominator. And Americans aren't.
Yeah. Yeah. They're
quite, dialed in.
Very much. I mean, here's the thing. It's easy to be dialed in when you've got something like X out there, because that has revolutionized how people get Legally Blonde. Cup there, Lisa. I see it. That has revolutionized.
Yeah, universal. Yeah.
How people receive their news, because you can go on X and you can get a good look around at just about everything that's happening within about 5 minutes, which you can't do even on a digital page. You've got to go to 2 or 3 sites, maybe 4 or 5 sites to get the complete spread of what's going on. But you can do that in X now in just a few minutes. So the digital broadsheets and red tops, they have to provide something different. And what they're providing is a comforting echo chamber to both the people on the left and the people on the right. And the way they echo that is by shooting for the lowest common denominator that reinforces the basest instincts of the people who are wedded to their particular ideologies, whether that's on the left or the right. Perhaps. That's just
underestimating the American public. Look where it got them.
Oh, yeah. I mean, these places are falling apart now.
Isn't there a Latin phrase that works here? The thing speaks for itself.
Res ipsa loquiter or loquitur, I think.
Yes.
I'm not sure of the pronunciation there.
You are the Latin man. Okay, thank you.
Well, the only Latin I was thinking of was status quo, as quoted by Ronald Reagan. Status quo is Latin for the mess that we're and that appears to be the status for the media at the moment. Well, I don't want to say the media, specifically the big box media, the legacy media.
Yeah.
And we know this from personal experience, Lisa, that boutique outlets that are focused on maybe looking at something through a lens, like, for example, Liberty Nation, the sponsor of this here show, looks at modern politics and happenings in the world through the lens of the Constitution. And that's a very specific lens. So everything's about constitutionality, liberty, freedoms, things like this, things that affect everyday people, but with that lens, the idea of the founding fathers. And these places like ours, we're rising massively at the moment. And many other boutique places that deal with specific areas are, but the ones that are looking for the scattergun approach to delivering news, I won't name names, but your main national broadsheets, they're suffering. They're suffering under the weight of their own expanse. And this is being pushed harder by the fact that you now have Donald Trump 2.0, I guess maybe even Donald Trump 3.0, who seems to be creating news on an hourly basis. And they can't keep up trying to do everything. So they're just failing at delivering anything, really.
Well, I think you make a point. We could go on and on about the liberal media, but let's get into some of the stuff he's been doing, because that's really fascinating.
Well, I tell you what, we will pick up what Donald Trump is doing, what his administration is doing after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio, head coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we continue to be joined by Liberty Nation's executive editor, Lisa K. Donna. So, Lisa, earlier in the show, we were discussing the new Gaza movement, make Gaza great again, make Gaza great again, and of course how the legacy media has been covering that. But yes, I'd like to move on to talk about what Donald Trump has been doing, what the administration has been doing, and what that means for America. And I think maybe to kick this off, let's talk USAID, or US aid, as some people do say it, because they're convinced that it's got something to do with charity work, which is obviously not the case, is it, Lisa?
No, it is not the case. USAID stands for the United States Agency for International Development. It's actually a way to embed the U.S. into other nations. And places like the State Department And ultimately, the CIA used this as what's known as soft power, right? I mean, you don't always go in with guns ablaze, or before you go in with guns ablaze, you better know the community really well and the country really well. But anyway, this has ballooned beyond any kind of recognizable proportion. It's now at $72 billion in 2023. We gave 72 B as in billion dollars to other countries through USAID. So I did a little research and let me go through it. Here's a short breakdown. 16 billion to Ukraine, 1.6 billion to Ethiopia, 1.9 billion to Jordan, 1 billion to Afghanistan. You can imagine when we were in the Afghanistan war what that might have been.
Yeah.
Wait. And in the vicinity of 1 billion for Somalia, the Congo, Syria, Nigeria, Yemen, and South Sudan. That's a lot of money.
I mean, that's really just the tip of the iceberg, though. That's direct to countries for specific reasons. And then, of course, you've got the programs that are being sponsored that take place within those countries as well, you've looked a lot into this, Lisa. You did a great article on the page of libertynation.com where you dove quite deeply into some of the various things that's happening in this arena. But correct me if I'm wrong here. It seems to me that these extra funding things that they're sending for specific projects, USAID is sending for specific projects, it's really just a way to get a foot in the door. So, and specifically, I want to talk about what happened in Cuba, where I think it was through USAID, they created a social media app because X and Facebook was banned in Cuba. And so the USAID, I think it was USAID, it sounds like it was one of their products, created an app that claimed to be a nativist app for Cuba. And then it would get everybody interested through talking sports and great pictures and things like this. And then once it reached a certain threshold, it then switched over to encouraging revolution. And in many respects, even because of the demographic makeup there, sparking race wars. And that's paid for by U.S. tax dollars.
Yeah, also, I did some digging, and some of the stuff that we're funding now is very interesting. Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion musical in Ireland, $2.5 million for electric vehicles in Vietnam, $47,000 for a transgender opera in Colombia.
But Lisa,
Wait.
what would Colombians do without an American taxpayer-sponsored transgender opera? I mean, can you imagine the sadness that might bring?
In Peru, a transgender comic book for $32,000. Sex changes and LGBT activism in Guatemala. My $6 million to fund tourism in Egypt. And my personal favorite, $20 million to fund Sesame Street in Pakistan.
Right. So it's actually Afghanistan, I think, not Pakistan. I've actually watched some videos of that. The product exists. This Sesame Street for the Arab Muslim world. It actually exists, and I think I could do a better job with about $2,000. I really do. I think I could do it. It's all done on green screens and whatnot, and it's pure propaganda from what I gather. It's from what I can tell, it's all pure propaganda.
Well, there is a place for this. There is a place for helping another country with wells and food, and there is a place for doing that, because if we step out of that, China's going to step right in, and they've actually been doing that. They've actually been stepping into Africa as we've been stepping out of Africa. But, some electric cars and tourism and sex changes and comic books, and it's just, I think it's gotten crazy, which is why they've made it smaller and put it under the State Department. At least that's the last.
Well, that's the plan, isn't it? To put it under the State Department and shrink it. Now, there's politicians and activists and media decrying that Elon Musk has somehow launched a soft coup against the the USAID and in terms of State Department. And it's such nonsense. It's such again, we're coming back to this base level reporting of it. From what I can tell, I may be wrong, so I don't have all the information, is that there's a group of 6 young fellas who are very, very clear about coding, how to use systems and whatnot. And they're in there and they're looking for things that are blatantly wasteful. And they're highlighting them because, as Musk posted the other day, not a single request for funds has ever been rejected through the entire USAID thing for the last 10 years or something along these lines.
Well, that's true at the Treasury Department. I didn't realize he said that through USAID. He talked about nothing has been turned down at Treasury.
Right. That's it.
Okay.
Yeah. So you've got people looking at what are blatant wastes of blatant waste of taxpayer money, or examples that are not good stewardship of taxpayer.
Yeah, a lack of
money.
good stewardship. It's like you're playing with the, monopoly money. But, the taxpayers are coughing up their money and they're hoping the government does something good with it. I'm not sure that funding Sesame Street in whatever country is what they had in mind.
Well, that's the thing. You've got...
No, I am sure that is not what they had in mind.
Oh, of course not. Of course. You've got this ballooning debt that the country has and a deficit. And I think it's something ridiculous. Like each taxpayer in the US is on the hook for about $300,000 or something, just based on the national debt. And nobody seems willing to cut this down and get it back. Its funding levels basically stay the same or grow year on year. And you have this situation where people are crying and screaming in the streets because, they're looking at projects. Let's cut funding to, as you point out, Sesame Street in the Middle East. I mean, there's not a value there. There's not a value to the American taxpayer there. But what happens is, because the spending doesn't come down, either one of two things happen. Number one, the American people need to be taxed more. That's one option. The other option is that the services that they already get become worse. Those are the only two things.
Exactly.
So Americans are either having to pay more, which means that their lives are measurably worse, or they have worse services, which means their lives are measurably worse. Either way, the average American taxpayer's life is measurably worse because of the activities of USAID and other agencies. And Lisa, is there a way out of the hole?
Well, I think so. This Doge thing has the left really crazy. And I think as Musk keeps on and on and on and on, they can try to stop him in the courts, but it seems like a good portion of the American people are behind this.
There's going to be kind of an appetite for it. I mean, if Musk and Doge can save a specific amount of money, says, look, we've stopped this money being wasted. This money can either go into something else, or, we just don't need to collect it. And woe betide any future politician of either stripe that tries to stop that particular avalanche. Lisa K. Donna, thank you ever so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Mark.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we're joined by Liberty Nation's national correspondent, a man of letters in so many ways, Mr. John Clark. Thanks for being here, John.
Honored. Always fun.
So, John, let's what I'd really like to talk about with you is the upset that's taking place in DC politics at the moment and how that really spreads out to what's happening across the country. I think one of the most fascinating aspects is that the Republican Party appears to me, and my analysis might be wrong here, but the Republican Party is no longer the Republican Party. The power, the driving force behind the Republican Party is now MAGA. And I'm wondering what you think about that.
Well, I would. It's an interesting thought, and I hadn't thought of it that way. But I think you're right. Both parties here have their own divisions for a number of years. within the Republican side is between Donald Trump and his detractors. And then on the Democrat side, there's been the far left and the traditional blue dog Democrats. And I think what you're suggesting is that the Trump/MAGA messaging has triumphed. And I would add MAHA, because you have Kennedy in the mix, which has kind of pulled it a little bit to the center of those two poles on the conservative side. And even Trump's detractors are coming around and saying they'll be loyal. And there's actually a lot going on. And I think it's very intriguing for me to watch as well, as an American. And I'm hopeful, I've been long hopeful that both sides would come more to the middle. So I would suggest that there is a little bit more of a movement towards the middle. And I think part of these MAGA policies are designed to be responsive to working class Americans, to the problems with, illegal immigration and the economy. These are the issues that come to the surface for any populace when there are troubled times, and things like the environment or gender studies or, race theory start to fade into the background when people are losing their jobs and the price of eggs, as we hear about, is going astronomically high. So, yeah, I think you're right. And I think it's an incredible force of its own. And from what I hear from people that have actually been at the events regularly in D.C., is that the energy is just, they've never seen anything like it. And it's positive energy. It's not, it's not retaliatory energy. And I think that I'm hoping that will continue to be the case, and that it'll just, that more Americans will be drawn to that. And it is not going to be perfect, but that it'll be a force that sticks around for a while and repairs some of the damage to our nation that has been occurring in the past from both parties.
It's funny that you say the word that the energy was positive there, because that's first thing that popped into my mind, and now I can't get it out, is in the UK, there's Nigel Farage, Mr. Brexit. His nascent party, the Reform Party, is actually in the lead from all things. Now, there's not another general election for up to, I think, August 2029 is the latest it can be called, because there's not a set period for it. It's at the discretion of the Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister. But what the messaging that Nigel Farage keeps putting out is that the reason his party has now overtaken the Labour Party and the Conservatives in a distant third place, the Tory Party in a distant third place, is that his movement is filled with positivity about what the future can be. And I think we're actually seeing something that goes beyond national politics here. I think what we're seeing is a groundswell across the world, because it's both the curse and the blessing of globalism, right? That when something happens on a large scale in one country, it tends to filter across those connected, those interwoven nations. And what we're seeing is now a much more, as you point out, populist in nature, positive in intent, rising of political movements. What's the thing that stops them?
That stops the movements?
Yeah, because we have seen like these movements happen a lot before in many countries, but they don't tend to always make it. Now, I guess the last time such a thing happened in the United Kingdom was when the Labour Party first appeared, which I think that was just over 100 years ago, and it put the Liberals, now the Liberal Democrats, into third, fourth, fifth place, and that was an uprising movement. But we don't see it often. It's like once every 100 years or something.
Yeah, I just wanted to, understand. I actually think this one's here to stay. And you've said some very interesting things to me, because I've been a political observer and somewhat student of politics really my whole life, because it impacts our lives. I think this one's here to stay. And when you mention globalism, I think that's part of this. Globalism ultimately, Wendell Berry has observed, is the greatest weapon of mass destruction ever created by man, because it dissolves culture. Yep. It attacks culture. It also destroys economies. Europe and the U.S. are looking at, total free markets are really hurting farmers. Do you really want to export your food production to China and India and eat that in trust? And I don't, we have history of sometimes not being able to trust those products. So I think part of this is a populism that is maybe driven by a certain attachment to national identity. In Europe and here, we have immigration problems. Here's a huge blowback, and I follow the British news a little bit, and I see the stories about gangs attacking people. And if the party in power is perceived to be protecting those people instead of the common man, I mean, this is all interwoven, but also at core, who's going to support the working class? No party really does well supporting only the elites. Marie Antoinette could show us a little about that. And so I think this has legs, in answer to your question. And then the mainstream media, perhaps, and those in power try to portray this as right-wing, some kind of right-wing threat. And this I see all over Europe. I see this in France. I see it in what's happening in the French media, as in Holland, as farmers move to conservative parties to try to conserve their land, their values, and their traditions, and even their very livelihoods. They start getting labeled as somehow far-right extremists, as if populism is always bad and always from the right. I think the Russian Revolution would be regarded as populist, and it didn't come from the right, I don't think. So I think that a lot of it has to do not even just with money, which people's wallets in the past have been a big motivator for votes. They care about the environment until they can't pay their taxes or buy their eggs, as we say. So, but I think it's deeper than that. And I see that in the UK, and I'm not there, but having lived there, it's changed dramatically, and its cultural is under assault. And so there's another guy I'd reference here named Douglas Murray, and his The War on the West talks about
Fantastic author, yeah. Fantastic author.
Fantastic author, fantastic book. I recommend it to people. Jackie's read it as well. And it really, it uses this through the lens of his brain, how we can see with his great knowledge that this really is an assault on Western values and Western culture that transcends the individual nations and maybe even that nationalism, if again, that bad word of nationalism. And I think he's right. And I think people are sick of the self-hatred and the contempt. And you talk about negativity. That's very negative. It's very damaging. And I'll quote one more guy named Malcolm X. He said, "You cannot hate the root without hating the tree." And people are sick of hating both the root and the tree, and they want to put leaves back on it and water the roots. And I think that's what's happening in many parts of the world. And frankly, I think America has a big place to play in leading that. And Richard Legutko, who's a friend that I write with and has written a book about this called The Demon in Democracy. And he's talking about neoliberalism is not classical liberalism, and it's a toxic threat, and that it's already dominating Europe. And it'll be up to the U.S. to save the world from a globalist, totalitarianism. I think that's what's got a lot of people at the WEF and the global corporate level a little concerned about these upstart Americans reclaiming their constitution and their liberties and their patriotism. So that's my take on it.
How dare they?
Maybe you'll see it there too. I think that's why they'll attack Nigel.
What a couple of things that spring to mind off what you said there. One is that it's actually these pockets of nationalism within a globalist system. That's what, if we were intellectually honest, we'd call diversity within a globalist system, which is all well and good. Everybody loves diversity until it's diversity of thought, and it's really, in many ways, it's the diversity of thought, as you correctly allude to, that will save the world if there's some major catastrophe. Because if everybody's all in the same club, they have all the same people at the top of these these tiered hierarchies, then they all think the same. They go to the same universities. They join the same organizations, the WEF, for example. And these are not people who can think beyond the boundaries, because if they could, there wouldn't be such agreement. What's the word I'm looking for? Consensus amongst what should be done for the world, because they're not thinking from different with different outlooks ahead of them. And yeah, I think that's fascinating that the left hails diversity unless it's diversity of thought, which is a worrying and telling sign for the future. Now, we're going to come back with this conversation after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio. I remain Mark Angelides. We continue our conversation with John Clark. John, just before the break, we were talking about the lack of diversity of thought within the globalist apparatus. Do you want to carry on that thought?
Oh, I'll carry on for sure. I call it the Borg. And I would actually differ with you a little bit, because it does quell diversity of thought in the name of having the elitist, highest level of enlightened thought ever. But that doesn't allow for that diversity of cultures. I study farming. Not all farming is the same in America. I'm in Vermont. We have a lot of water, long winters. You go out west, they have to pump the water out of the ground. They don't have to worry about winters. In fact, right now they're trying to get their lambing done so they won't cook in the sun in Arizona. I often think about the Scots. I love Scotland. They wear kilts. They have quite the history of battle tales, even against the Romans. And then they throw poles around. Well, big poles that they throw in the air. If nobody, and
Tossing the caber, for those unfamiliar.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Yes, sir. I've watched it in fascination, and I like snooker. Now, what I see in Scotland is multiculturalism ultimately is the destroyer of culture, of local culture. And I picked Scotland because if I were to try to defend my Vermont culture, then I guess I'd be called a nativist or that I'm somehow a racist. And I pick up, how about the Japanese? They're imposing restrictions on who can work there because they want people that will preserve their language. The French have passed laws. You can't say French fries. The Italians are passing laws to protect their food. These are what shapes identity. And to refer to Wendell Berry again, he talks about how we're culturally connected, particularly to the soil and farming, and just look at the diverse histories within just Europe. And then to take those and try to combine them in a global Borg with totally different religious views and what have you. And as Victor Davis Hanson points out, this is what defines a nation. And here in America, that's how it relates to the undocumented aliens. If they're not complying with our laws and they're undermining the rule of law, and if they're not interested in assimilating in your culture, then your culture will not survive. And that seems to be the plan of some, as Murray points out. So I think you're hitting the nail right on the head. I think that preserving culture is just as important. If you're going to have diversity, you have to have those cultures intact and not denigrate and then crash them with a wrecking ball. And that's the balance that's out of balance. And how do you, looking at the numbers for the UK and the number of people not born there who do not believe in separation of church and state, for instance, who have a totally different worldview, how do you assimilate? How does that country survive and create a unifying culture as well as economy and other things with that kind of tension? And I think we see it all over the world. You're quite right.
Yeah, it's almost Europe is the canary in the coal mine, with England being the lead canary there, the advanced force of canaries, in terms of there's a certain element of society that wishes to see the destruction of all that held Britain together over the period of, well, it depends how long you want to go back in history, but from 1066 is essentially where, that's when we count our kings and queens from, is 1066, although obviously we had some rather amazing and some great ones, for those of you who know your history, before 1066. And there's a very clear message that's coming from the people who want to bury English culture, British culture, and that is that there's a sin that is at the heart of the United Kingdom, Britain, England specifically, even though obviously it was also with the Scots, and that is the empire building that took place all those years ago. And it seems that these people, and they are people who are in the upper echelons of power, and they are people who are just arrived on boats, who have this idea in their head that England and the English are a deeply racist, deeply colonialist past people who don't deserve their own country. And that's my worry is that people are being taught this kind of stuff in schools, and so you've got a whole generation growing up with this mind virus that people aren't just worth what they're worth based on their morality, their intrinsic value, their outlook, how they help other people, how they protect their families, but they are lumped in with a class just because, the color of their skin, their ancestors 300 years ago, who, let's be fair, most people's ancestors 300 years ago were peasants. And that's what we all were, right? There's only a few who weren't, and those people are still living the high life in the palaces. What's the cure? There's a big question for you, John. What's the cure?
Well, the cure is the truth. This is all built on lies. And actually, to quote Barry again, he calls it historical pride. I dealt with it here in Vermont. Vermont was the first state in the world, actually, because it was a state at the time to make, so we actually beat the British to it. We don't have to argue about that in Wilberforce, but in the 1790s to ban slavery. Right. And then we just had an amendment to our Constitution because it allowed for indentured servitude. So there were whole big tirades in our state legislature by progressive, so-called, saying, oh, well, it wasn't good enough. And somehow they would have been more enlightened then, they think, than those people, when they're not even that enlightened now. And so there is this arrogance, and it's false about the yes, of course, both of our countries have had times of perhaps embarrassing tragedies. Does that mean we throw out the whole model? The whole thing has been aspirational. What the British did to try to, perhaps in repentance, spend many lives and much treasure, and Murray talks about this in his book, to wipe out the global slave trade and the history of the Barbary pilots, and the fact that they were also taking white people off the coasts by maybe millions from the UK and taking them away. Well, that's part of the history. And the history of, Americans having killed the American Indians and given them blankets to give them smallpox on purpose, that's not true. The whole, 1619 project is a rewrite of history. And so every culture is defined in part by their history. And we do wrangle with how to most truthfully tell it. But the American experience is not just the experience of slavery, it's the experience of abolitionism. And this morning I saw someone attacking Bobby Kennedy and me for supporting him for HHS, because they said, how could you support somebody who is a drug addict? And I said, well, I work with drug addicts. He deserves credit for that. Do you understand how difficult it is to surmount that? This isn't even the blackface. We're going to actually punish people for the sins of their great-grandfathers? Ultimately, that is the new racism, the new eugenics, the statement that because you're white, you are therefore subconsciously racist, whether you know it or not. And if you're male, you're patriarchal. Even if you're, very sick and have spent 30 years working for the poor, it doesn't matter. And you can grovel all you want. You can never redeem yourself from it. That's what we've moved away from, Mark, here in this country. And look at what the UK is doing with stifling speech, because heaven forbid you could speak freely, you might challenge the lie. So free speech allows truth. Truth defeats lies. That's what we see in America, where every demographic group has shifted towards the right, even particularly and notably the Black and Hispanic people that have been preyed upon and exploited by the left, who then didn't do anything for them. They're waking up to the fact that they're being played, that racism is being used to exploit them for the power of technocrats and those who benefit from the lies. And so the common people have to return to becoming educated about the truth. And if they don't stand up for it, well, then they become proles, right, to reference Orwell.
The truth shall indeed set you free. John Clark, thanks ever so much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
And that's all we have time for this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to thank our guests today, Lisa K. Donner and John Clark. And of course, extend my gratitude to you, the listeners at home, for taking the time to join us each and every week. Please do remember, Liberty Nation does not endorse campaigns, candidates, or legislation. And this presentation is no endorsement. Thanks for being here.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.